I would say that the Marvel Cinematic Universe is the most successful film series ever made. You can dispute that if you want, but it's not that bold of a statement. Endgame was the highest grossing movie of all time. Black Panther was nominated for Best Picture. The critics seem to like them. The audiences generally like them. I like them. To me, they're some of the most impressive movies out there. When we look at this unprecedented success that they've been experiencing for over a decade now, it feels strange to say that throughout their history, Marvel has struggled quite a bit. I know, you wouldn't expect that. They've been one of the biggest names in comics, created some of the most iconic characters. Even before the MCU, their characters were the focus of some of the biggest superhero movies. Yet, they have experienced some major rises and falls. In 1996, they even filed for bankruptcy. I want to talk about that, along with some key fluctuations over the years, going all the way back to the beginning. In the late 1930s, comic books were really starting to get popular. Before Marvel even existed, in 1938, Action Comics #1 was published, first exposing the world to Superman. And of course, it was a big financial success, and it caused a lot of people to start looking at comic books as a business with some high potential. Well, about a year later, we have Martin Goodman, who was in the publishing business, specializing in these pulp magazines. I always think of the movie Pulp Fiction when I hear that, but they were these cheap fictional stories printed on this low-quality paper. It was a big thing at the time. Back to comics, there was this company called Funnies Inc. that represented some writers and artists of comic books. They approached Goodman with a proposal where essentially the talent from Funnies Inc. would create the comic and then hand it off to Goodman where he would print it and distribute it. Since it seemed like a promising industry, something that he might want to be a part of, Goodman agreed. The first comic that was published under this arrangement was none other than Marvel Comics #1, today considered to be the first ever Marvel comic. That is just awesome to look at. Can you imagine buying that for 10 cents? It notably featured the Human Torch and the Submariner, both of which went on to become flagship characters for Marvel. That first comic was such a success that it motivated Goodman to form a new company dedicated to comics called Timely Productions. You may have thought I was going to say Marvel there, but Martin Goodman, I questioned some of his marketing decisions. That first one was clearly branded under Marvel Comics, but they didn't consistently use that name until more than 20 years later. The company was initially called Timely Productions, later morphed into Atlas Publishing in the early 1950s. The comics were separately branded, typically without any clear indication of who made them. I'll pass over the specifics, but just know that despite starting with that massive Marvel Comics logo, the name wasn't too significant for them for the next couple of decades. Alright, on to their first rise. Their early success can be explained by, well, obviously getting into a growing industry and having cool characters, but possibly more than anything, they were capitalizing on World War II. Dated March 1941 was the first issue of Captain America, and this is just another iconic cover. It is literally Captain America punching Adolf Hitler in the face. And the amazing thing is that this was published months before the US even entered the war. This more serious, topical brand of content started attracting an older audience. Members of the military themselves were reading them. It's pretty clear that the war was a huge contributor to the growth of this company and comic books in general. On the negative end, it is not ideal to have your sales tied to something like this, because by 1945, the war was over, and that was bad news for the comic book industry, specifically the superheroes. They weren't as relevant, and people weren't responding to them quite the same way, and as a result, the sales went down at Timely Productions. I'm gonna go ahead and call that their first fall. The way that they rose up from it was pulling away from the superheroes and making their way into other genres of comic books. In 1950, for a while, they retired their 3 flagship heroes in favor of other types of publications. I'm talking about romance, science fiction, cowboys, horror, different ones intended for men, women, children. They were making everything. By the 1950s, there were dozens of different series. They had recovered because when their old methods stopped working, they were able to find new ways to attract an audience and maintain their attention. It did not last long though, because 1954 already marks the start of their next major fall. This time, it was the Comics Code Authority. In short, comic books were receiving a lot of heat from the parents. They claimed that they were creating criminals by warping the minds of America's youth, or whatever, you know how it goes. The issue was, those parental groups also held some power. At the time, comic books were not sold at specialty stores. It was all grocery stores bookstores and newsstands, places where parents shopped, and the comic books made up a small percentage of their sales. The parents would simply say, "I'm not going to shop at these places until they get rid of the comics," so they agreed. I'm sorry if I sound like I'm disrespecting the issue. I can understand their concern at the time. Some of these comics were excessive, but they were just going overboard with it. There were these public comic burnings. It even made its way into Congress. It was actually looking like the government may pass some kind of censorship laws, so to get in front of it, the comic book companies created the Comics Code Authority. Each comic that met their criteria would receive their stamp of approval, and as long as it had that stamp, the parents were fine with it, the stores could sell it, and everything was fine. It sounds like a solution, but it only hurt their sales even more, mostly because that criteria was strict. It altered the language, how the crimes were portrayed, how the people were drawn, and overall, it just made the comics so much more bland and boring. Many people were reading them for their edgy content, and as I said before, many of them weren't even kids. It's like if all of a sudden every movie had to be G-rated, which would not be good for the industry. These stamps continued too. The criteria was loosened, but Marvel still had them on some of their comics through 2001. The comeback from this was because of Stan Lee. There were other people and other factors involved, but I like to think that Stan Lee was at the center of it. He had worked for Marvel almost from the beginning. He was hired as a teenager in their first year of business and soon promoted to editor. Then, in 1961, after 22 years with the company, along with artist Jack Kirby, he created the Fantastic Four. That first issue marked the beginning of a new era for the company and started to shape Marvel into what we know them as today. Unlike the standard at the time, Stan Lee's new characters were imperfect. They would argue, have internal struggles, and were somehow much more relatable. And over the next few years, he would introduce multiple others that fit that criteria. Spider-Man, the Incredible Hulk, X-Men a little later. This is when the Marvel Universe started to form, and finally, the comics were branded under that Marvel name. Amazingly, Stan Lee found a way to reattract the readers while conforming to the strict set of codes. Okay, there were some other minor fluctuations in their business throughout the 70s and 80s, but I want to skip ahead to their biggest one that occurred in the 1990s. In the early 90s, everything was seemingly better than ever. Sales were hitting all-time highs, but some of those numbers may have been a little deceptive. In the 1980s and early 1990s, for many people, comic books became less about reading them and more about collecting them. Comic book stores were popping up everywhere, and certain comics were being sold for hundreds or thousands of dollars. Now, collectibles can be dangerous because so often their value gets inflated, and once everyone figures that out, the bubble bursts, and that's not good for anybody. Let me tell you what happens. Marvel puts out a new comic that everyone thinks is going to be really valuable one day. So instead of one copy, I buy 5 copies, as does everyone else. And since everyone bought so many of them, well, they're just worthless now. In the meantime, Marvel just made a ton of sales, but once this bubble burst and we all realized that we just wasted our money buying 5 copies of a comic that we didn't even care about reading once, we're done buying comics. The whole situation resulted in a dramatic rise and fall in sales, which is bad news, but not quite bad enough to force them into bankruptcy. That's where the debt becomes a factor. Leading up to 1993, when Marvel was on top of the world, they were spreading themselves thin by going into debt to buy all these other companies. They would have been able to handle that debt as long as their sales had stayed strong, but since their sales fell, they couldn't make their payments and they filed for bankruptcy. Now that's enough to justify it, but there's even another layer to this. In the early 90s, they were working to expand into trading cards. In 1992, they bought Fleer for $265 million. Trading cards are another industry that famously created a bubble that burst right around the same time. Maybe if they had bought into something else, they could have used those sales to power through, but you could see how these decisions just made things worse. Following the bankruptcy, there were new owners, but first I want to take a quick detour and talk about all the transfers of ownership that have happened with Marvel. I'll do it fast. Remember, in 1939, it was formed by Martin Goodman. He owned it until 1968, when it was bought by Perfect Film and Chemical Corporation, who quickly changed their name. In 1986, it was sold to a film company called New World Pictures, much with it because they sold it to Andrews Group 2 years later. That's who owned it leading up to the bankruptcy. It was led by this guy Ron Perlman, who tends to get a lot of the blame for their failure. Then, following the bankruptcy, in 1998, this company Toy Biz became the new owners and changed their name to Marvel. Strangely enough, Toy Biz was one of the companies that Marvel acquired preceding the bankruptcy. 5 years earlier, Marvel bought 46% of them in this big deal that included an extended licensing agreement for their toys. Alright, that was a lot, and I might as well just finish it because we all know where this is heading. In 2009, Marvel was acquired by Disney for around $4 billion in a deal that included both cash and stock. I have to think that their motivation behind this acquisition was the rights to the thousands of characters they would receive and the rights to make movies about them. Even before Disney was involved, it was looking like movies were going to be the future of Marvel. The way they were going about it was to make deals with the studios to sell them the rights to their characters. You know, the rights to Spider-Man went to Sony, and then the rights to X-Men and some others went to Fox. The issue with that was, superhero movies weren't nearly as big as they are today, and there wasn't much value in selling the movie rights. So the movies were making money, but due to the deals that were in place, Marvel was not seeing much of it. In 2005, they figured that it would be smarter to try to create their own studio, and that way they can keep all of their profits. That's when they took out a $525 million loan to create Marvel Studios. Soon after, they put out Iron Man, the first movie that they fully funded by themselves, and we all know what a huge success it was. The following year, Disney bought Marvel, and together they've done something special in creating some of the coolest, most financially successful movies of all time. So, for the final and most dramatic rise and fall, the fall was from the bubble bursting in the comic book and trading card industries, along with excessive debt, and the rise, I think we can say, is from their transition into films and the involvement of Disney.
Thanks for watching. Like and subscribe our channel.